Today I'm going to show you how to create box shadows using GenerateBlocks 2.0 and also show you a couple scenarios where you should and should not use box shadows, and then how you can set those up to reuse them throughout the rest of your site for consistency. Alright, so I've set up a demo page here with a layout kind of showing like services section with a few cards and then an overlapping container below that. This one on top is shown on a light background, and below we've got the same thing on a dark background. So when it comes to box shadows, I always think you should keep it more subtle and don't overuse it. I think that box shadows can easily turn a design from really polished and clean to just looking dated and clunky. So you want to only use box shadows in areas that are going to help elevate the design in really small ways instead of relying on it to boost the design of your page. Now, one of those ways that I think box shadows work perfectly are on a card design like this layout. As I have the white cards on a very light background, this is a perfect opportunity where there is lower contrast between the background and the foreground to be able to utilize a box shadow to sort of push those boxes to the forefront and create more depth to your layout and design. So by selecting the container that's holding my card here, where we can do in GenerateBlocks 2.0 is come on down to effects, and you'll see a bunch of options here show up, and that first one is a box shadow. So we'll go ahead and click to add a new one, and by default it pulls in a bunch of presets. So we've got 10 pixel X and Y offset, we got 5 pixel blur and 7 pixel spread. Now I'm going to show you the setup that I normally go for on, I'd say 80% of the time that I'm using box shadows. So I usually go for a little bit, probably about 15% opacity on black. You can, of course, use one of your brand colors and pull it down. Just make sure that the contrast is there enough against that background color that it's going to be effective. Now, I always like to zero out the X and Y. Again, 80% of the time, I just like that box shadow centered up evenly all around the edges. And then the blur, I bump up to anywhere from 15 to 25. We'll go 20 pixels. As I think the greater you go in that range, the smoother it gets, but we certainly don't want too much where it becomes so smooth, where it's too big and less effective. And then on spread, instead of having a positive number here, I actually like to bring this down to a negative number. So many may not know you can do a negative pixel spread so that it starts to shrink that box shadow inside, so that it doesn't spread so far outside the box. So I usually go down to about -4, -5 maybe. And that's it. So that's my setup for a normal box shadow. As you can see, compared to the others, and we'll go ahead and save it so we can look at this on the front end. Compared to the others, this one definitely just stands off the page, right? It's very subtle. You could even go a hair darker on the opacity for it. But honestly, it's achieving exactly what I feel a box shadow should achieve, and that's just creating a small amount of depth. Now, the other perfect scenario that I like to use a box shadow is on overlapping containers. So as you saw on the front end here, I've got a container that overlaps the colored background with the white background, and as a result we lose the total edge of that container because it overlaps onto white on white. So a drop shadow on this container would really help, again, lift that container off and kind of give it a really soft edge that isn't lost on the background that it matches. So we'll go in and go ahead and do the same kind of settings. We'll go 0, 0, 20, and -4. Go ahead and save that and come to our front end. And again, you can see now it just adds that little soft edge, pushes it off the page for you and separates it so that you can see it from the background color that it matches here when it overlaps. Now, one of the areas I don't recommend using a box shadow is when the foreground and background contrast is too great. So that means essentially when it's really light foreground and really dark background, because essentially when we go to put a box shadow on this and we set it up, even if we go, fully dark on it and we do our normal settings, -4, and we can go ahead and save that. We come to the front end and you look and see there's virtually no difference whatsoever, because dark drop shadow on that dark background just doesn't have the contrast to really make any difference. And the difference in the contrast from the two colors, in my opinion, already is pushing that content forward and creating the depth that we need. So I really only recommend it when the foreground and background contrasts are much lower. Now, an area that you could utilize on a dark background is if it's an overlapping container like this, because it does overlap into a color that matches the background color of our container. It'll help differentiate it and give it a soft edge without having to put any type of border on it. So we can go ahead and add this effect on here again. All right, so if we save that and refresh our page, you can see now, even though the effect is virtually not visible on the dark background, it still really helps push it off the page on the area where it overlaps onto white. Now, if you're working on your website and want to be able to add box shadows throughout your website whenever you need it, the best thing to do is go ahead and set up a global class for box shadows. Now, in my personal starter site, I actually have a few different global classes set up for a small box shadow, a medium box shadow, and a large box shadow. And you don't necessarily need to set up 3. You just set up whatever style you want to use throughout your site. But the important thing is to be consistent. And so what we can do then is I'll choose the middle container here and we'll create a new style, and we'll call this shadow small. And we'll say a blank style, and then we can go into the effect, add the box shadow, go ahead and create our settings here, 0, 0, 20, and -4. And that's it. So now I can come to the third card here, click add, and say shadow small. So now that global class with those box shadow effects settings are now applied to that container. So it's the perfect use to be able to really manage your box shadows on a global basis, because if you wanted to come back and say, you know what, these small box shadows that I added in this global class, I actually want them a little bit bigger or a little bit smaller, we just select that global class, click edit on our settings. Maybe we go up to 40 on the blur, or we say we want it to be offset on the Y by 10 pixels so that it's pushed down on the bottom. And everywhere that class is applied will be updated with the shadow settings. Now, one last area that I think is a good use of box shadows is on buttons. So if we go ahead and add a button and we say contact us, and then I go ahead and choose one of my button styles. If I wanted to add a box shadow to the button, I can go ahead and actually choose that same class, and it'll apply to a button as well. So it doesn't have to just be containers, it's virtually anything. Now, I don't recommend stacking drop shadows. And now what that means is I wouldn't put this button with the drop shadow in a section that has a drop shadow already. It becomes a little too clip arty, like piecing things together and layering it in a way that just overuse. Again, drop shadows or box shadows, I keep mixing the two. Always be a very subtle use. All right, so that was just a quick lesson on box shadows in GenerateBlocks 2.0. I showed you how to set up a box shadow, some of the best practices and where you should utilize them, and then how to create a global class so that you can apply box shadows anywhere on your site. Thanks a lot for watching, and we'll see you next time.